Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. This is the second lecture in the Lowe Family Lecture Series on modern Jewish studies with Polish scholars. So this lecture series this year, it builds on the last lecture series that we had last year under the title of New Holocaust Research from Poland. The Lowe Lecture Series is generally supported by the Lowe Family Holocaust and Genocide Education Endowment, and we are very grateful to the Lowe family for their continued support. It's also co-sponsored by the Malikian Center with an institution here that focuses on Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies. And Jewish Studies has done many programs with the Malikian Center, and of course we will do more in the future, even the immediate future in October when we are doing a conference that the Malikian Center will be involved. So last Thursday, we heard a powerful lecture by Professor Joanna Nalewajko-Kulikov of Lund University. The title, as you may remember, was Voices of Jewish Child Survivors, and the lecture focused on testimonies from children as sources for the documentation of the Holocaust, namely, how do we write the history of the Holocaust on the basis of those testimonies? It was a fascinating lecture. And today, the focus will be on the use of Yiddish and Yiddish culture as a means for the perpetuation of Jewish life. At least that's how I understand the title of the lecture, Perpetuation of Jewish Life After the Holocaust. So to those who are joining us for the first time, let me introduce myself. I'm Chabat Samuelson. I'm a Regents Professor here, as well as Irving and Miriam Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, and the Director of Jewish Studies. As I indicated this past Thursday, in addition to instruction on a BA and MA level and giving degrees to students, we also offer a very robust program of public education. We cover Jewish history, the Jewish religion, Jewish culture, and we do so from a variety of perspectives, disciplinary perspectives, be they historical, philosophical, religious, sociological, anthropological, political, or artistic. So our lecture series on Polish Jewish history, those two lecture series last year and this year were organized by Professor Anna Cichopek-Gajraj. She's an associate professor at the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. She focuses on the relationship between Jews and non-Jews before, during, and after World War II in Central and in Eastern Europe. Her current research focuses on migrations of ethnic Poles and Polish Jews in the post-war period and their efforts to rebuild their life. Professor Cichopek-Gajraj will introduce the speaker for today, as well as kind of contextualize the lecture series as she sees fit. So Anya, this is all yours, and we're listening to you now.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the second of our two sessions of what I call a series of two Joannas, or my two excellent colleagues, Joanna Nalewajko-Kulikov and Joanna Nalewajko-Kulikov, both natives of Poland who specialize in the 20th century history of Polish Jews. So today I'm very happy to introduce our second guest, my wonderful colleague, Professor Joanna Nalewajko-Kulikov. Professor Kulikov is associate professor in Warsaw at the Tadeusz Manteuffel Institute of History at the Polish Academy of Sciences. She is also editor-in-chief of the English language journal Acta Poloniae Historica. Her research mainly focuses on Yiddish language, culture, press, more specifically and more generally on the history of East European Jews in 19th and 20th centuries and on Polish-Jewish relations. She's a very well-published author, a very well-regarded author. She published 4 monographs. The most recent one is the subject of our today's meeting, and its title, as you can see in front of you, A Citizen of Yiddishland, Dawid Swart and the Jewish Communist Milieu in Poland. This book was already awarded. It received 2022 Jordan Schnitzer, a very important award in Jewish studies, Jordan Schnitzer Book Award finalist. Her 2016 Polish monograph on the beginnings of mass circulation of Yiddish press in Warsaw is currently being translated, and it will be published, I hope, soon. She also edited several source kind of primary document collections, including Emanuel Ringelblum Notes from the Warsaw Ghetto. She is also author of numerous important peer-reviewed articles in Polish, English, and I guess also in other languages as well. Currently, she's working on 2 book projects. One is on Yiddish press in interwar Poland, and the other is on the history of a British and foreign Bible society in the Polish land. So when Professor Nalewajko-Kulikov gives her lecture, you are free to post your questions in chat, in Q&A section. After her lecture, I will ask her a couple of questions, and then we will open the floor to the audience and to your questions from chat and from Q&A. Professor Nalewajko-Kulikov will speak today to us about citizens of Yiddishland, or when Jewish communists did not cease to be Jewish. Joasiu, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anya. Thank you, Hava. Thank you also, Lisa, for your help. Thank you for having me here. Let me just say before I start my talk that it's 9 p.m. here in Warsaw. So please forgive me if I am not coherent enough in English, but I will do my best at this time. The book that is which cover you can see here on the screen it is actually the English translation of my PhD, which was defended in 2007. It seems so very long ago, at the Institute of History of the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, but the version was of course slightly updated and changed for the English-speaking reader. And I would only like to mention two persons without whom the publication of this book in English wouldn't have been possible. One is Dr. Paul Glasser, which has been for many years associated with the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York, who was the translator of this book into English. And the other was Reise Turner, who is now a doctoral student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she was an absolutely perfect copy editor of this book. So in case you're looking for a good copy editor, I can let me know, and I will give you her email. And just as I said in the in the end of the introduction to this book is theirs as much as it is mine, because I sort of had an impression of writing it again when it was translated into English. And now let me move to the first. I hope you can see. I hope you can see the new picture on the screen. This is actually the same picture that is to be seen on the cover of the book. Oh, sorry, no. And I wanted to start with this picture because it shows very nicely the how the post-war milieu of Polish Jews was various in many ways. This is a picture taken at the gathering of the organizing committee of Polish Jews in Moscow in November 1945. So just before they started to organize the repatriation of Polish Jews from the Soviet Union to liberated Poland. These are mostly people, but actually not all of them, but many of them who were associated with the communist movement. And I wonder if you can see when I'm moving right now my, the marker on the screen. Okay, Anya gives me a sign, thank you. So actually, I would like here to focus on the three biographies of three people whom I find especially important for this chapter in the Polish Jewish postwar history. And later I will try to present some more general remarks. So this among the people whom we have here, we've got, for example, right in the middle, Ida Kamińska, the famous Yiddish actress who left Poland in 1968 and who was never a communist. We can see the guy here whom you can see is Avrom Sutzkever, later one of the most famous poets of the Yiddish literature in the 20th century. But I would like to focus here on three people, namely on Binem Heller, who is here, then on Bernard Mark, who is here, and David Sfard, who was the main protagonist of my book. Starting with Binem Heller, who was born in Warsaw in 1908 in a poor Hasidic family. He was actually raised up to earn his living as a glove maker. And actually he started at a very young age to earn his living as a glove maker. But then he became a poet. He became associated with the Communist Party of Poland in the 1930s. For some time, he was even abroad because of some persecutions that he suffered as a communist, and he was actually one of the most or the best Yiddish poets, in my opinion at least, best Yiddish poets in Poland in the second half of the 20th century. When the Second World War broke out, he escaped to Bialystok, who was then in the Soviet-occupied zone of Poland, in the eastern Poland. He was there part of the local literary establishment. He was actually quite popular as the revolutionary poet who was persecuted for his ideas in pre-war Poland. He survived the war in the Soviet Union, and then he came back to Poland. And he was active in various Jewish organizations. Here I mentioned Yiddische Schriften, which was a Yiddish literary monthly, which was published until 1968. And he was very active as a poet. He was author of many poetic volumes. You can see some examples of them here. And he was also active as a I would say as a revolutionary poet. And this is also a picture we can see from one of these sort of more like propaganda cultural events. It's one of the, it's a meeting which is devoted, to the Yiddish readership, because actually the sign, which you can maybe see, says that the Yiddish book is fighting for peace and socialism, right? So it was one of these particular propaganda events which were commonly held in the first half of the 1950s. In 1956, after the secret speech of Nikita Khrushchev became well known, the famous secret speech on the so-called cult of personality, in other words, about the Stalinist purges, it came as a great shock, basically, to this whole milieu of Jewish communists. But one of those who were especially hard hit was Binem Heller. In fact, it was in this year that he left Poland, and eventually he settled down in Israel, where he continued to work as a poet, but never again, he had nothing in common, with this milieu of Jewish communists, as far as I know. And he passed away in Tel Aviv towards the end of the 1990s. Now, our second protagonist tonight is Bernard or Bermark, who was born in Łomża, which is Ulomża in Yiddish, then in Congress, Poland, and who was who also received some religious and secular education, and he actually graduated from the law faculty of the Warsaw University, but he rather gained his living as earned his living as a teacher of Polish language and literature in Jewish primary schools. He also joined the communist movement in the 1920s or 30s. It was quite common then. He also escaped to Białystok once the war broke out. And later, when he was already evacuated into the USSR after the Soviet-German war broke out, he started to collaborate with the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. And he was actually one of the contributors to the famous Black Book of Russian Jewry, or Soviet Jewry, depending on the translation. You can see one of the, I'm not sure whether this is the most common English translation, but this is the one I was able to find, online. And he also headed the organizing committee of Polish Jews, which was active in Moscow. And upon returning to Poland, he started to work at the newly created Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, when he actually became its director in 1949. And he kept this post until his premature death in 1966. And he was mostly considered, at least until 1956, as a regime historian. He was very notorious for this vision of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, in which the Jewish communists in the Warsaw Ghetto, he assumed that they played the main role, which wasn't true, of course, but that was what he was writing in the early 1950s. You can see one of the a cover of one of his books on the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. After this political thaw of 1956, he changed his mind. He changed his opinions. He started to visit Israel, for example. And actually, it's an interesting story, because gradually, from being like a fervent communist, he gradually became someone actually suspicious in the eyes of the Polish political police. In the 1960s, they began to supervise him. Actually, there are some preserved files on whom he met and who was talking to him, files in which he was actually presented not as our old communist fellow, but actually as a Jewish nationalist, which makes an interesting round. And he was also gradually becoming disappointed, in the communism, in what was going on in Poland. And we've got a very nice, nice in terms of meaning interesting, very, very important source, which is his diary, which he kept in the very last months of his life. He was severely ill, and he passed away prematurely, as I said. So he kept this diary for 2 months, maybe at the most, at the turn of 1965 and 1966. And this is a wonderful source on what was going on then among the Jewish communists in this Jewish milieu of his, where you can actually have a look into how they gradually became disappointed in the communism, and how they gradually started to feel that they are actually not needed anymore by the Polish authorities. It is a very moving actually source, and I'm happy to say that it is forthcoming. It is forthcoming in a translation from Yiddish into English in East European Jewish Affairs. I hope maybe even this year, because it was already we were dealing, with the proofs for at least half of the vacations. So hopefully it will be finally available for an English-speaking reader, and this is really, I think, a marvelous source. And as I said, Mark died prematurely in 1966. He's buried in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery. He's actually the only one of these three people that really that died in Warsaw. Even though he did express such a wish in his diary that if I die, I would like to be buried in Israel. There are some very moving pro-Israeli statements in this diary of his. And now moving on to our last protagonist, to David or Dovid Sfard. I used I used David when I was writing my PhD, but I think my copy editor wanted him to sound more Yiddish, so we went for Dovid in the English translation. He was born in Turisk, which is in Volhynia in today's Ukraine, at the beginning of the century. And he was actually the most, the best educated of all of them, because he had a PhD which he made in philosophy in interwar France. He came from a rabbi's family, which was relatively well off. So, for example, he also knew how to speak Hebrew. And upon returning from France, he joined the communist movement. It was in the early 1930s. And then during the war, just like Heller and just like Mark, he also fled to Bialystok. Later, he was evacuated into the Soviet Union. He also worked in this organizing committee of Polish Jews. And upon returning to Poland in 1946, he became, one of the most engaged, I would say, activist in this Jewish communist milieu. He was the editor of Yiddische Schriften, of this literary monthly, which I mentioned already. He was also the general secretary of the Socio-Cultural Association of Jews in Poland for some 12 years, which was the association which actually was like the official legal association of Jews, allowed by the Polish authorities starting of 1950s, which is actually quite remarkable, taking into account what was going on in the Soviet Union at this time, for example, right? So it wasn't that obvious that the Jews would have their own association, even though it was, of course, run by the Jewish communists, and it followed actually, the line of the party. Later, he was also not later, but at the same time, he was also the main editor at the Yiddish book publishing house. It was the only publishing house in post-war Poland that published books in Yiddish. And he was very active, very engaged in various events and various ideas in this milieu. In 1968, with the anti-Semitic campaign that started in Poland, he actually decided to leave, because one of the reasons that he decided to leave was that the Polish authorities demanded that everything that was submitted, to be published by the Yiddish press or by the Yiddish publishing house was to be submitted to the censorship for an approval, accompanied by a translation into Polish. And that was a very hard request, because basically everything was being censored. I mean, Polish books and Polish press was also censored, so it wasn't just exceptionally for the Jews. But until 1968, there were Jewish censors who were able to read Yiddish. So actually, for example, a Yiddish periodical could simply submit, the whole issue in Yiddish, and the Yiddish-speaking censor would read it. And in 1968, basically, all the Yiddish censors got fired from work because they were Jewish, which is hardly surprising. And actually, this Yiddish book publishing house, and basically this whole milieu of Jewish communists, was plainly told that if you want to publish something in Yiddish, it must be you must present it to the censorship accompanied by a translation into Polish, unless it was something very official, like for example the speech of the first secretary, right, which was be given in Polish anyway. And this basically meant that it wasn't possible to write in Yiddish anymore, because it's not possible to write everything in the same languages at the same time. So basically, it was the end of this Yiddish book publishing house, and that was the last straw, actually, that made SFAR decide to leave Poland. Maybe not the very last, because his son was also involved in the students' protests, and he was in jail for several months. So actually, his parents simply worried about him. The family moved to Israel, and SFAR passed away in Jerusalem, and he's buried in Jerusalem. And this is a picture with his grandson, which is already, of course, in Israel. And now, having presented very briefly, of course, these three biographies, which you can see, they have some common features, right, and some common experiences. I would like to focus on several things which I consider the most important when we are talking about this, and which are also like a common experience for all of them. Because here, of course, I focused on people who were actually very well exposed in this milieu of Jewish communists, right? So someone, for example, who was reading Yiddish, of course, he knew, Sfart or Mark or Heller. These were like very well-known names. They were, so to speak, the faces of this version of Jewish communism. So one thing was their Jewish identity, and here is a thing which is very, which I absolutely must say, because it's not always clear when we are talking about a Jewish communist what we mean, right? It does not mean that all Jewish communists in Poland were people who spoke Yiddish and who wanted to preserve their Jewish identity. In fact, most, I believe, of people of Jewish background who joined the communist movement in the interwar period or later, but usually in the interwar period, they did it in order to they did it because they felt attracted to the fact that there can be a world which does not make a difference between Jews and non-Jews, right? So sometimes they did it because they didn't feel comfortable with being Jewish, because they felt unwelcomed maybe in interwar Poland, right? Because maybe they felt, like a second category citizens, and sometimes it was indeed so. And sometimes they did it because simply they thought, okay, this is the right idea, right? This is the world that it should be, and there should be no Jews and no Jews, right? Because we are all humans. So it was very. It was this internationalist thought that was important for many of people of Jewish background who joined the communist movement. So when we are talking about post-war Poland, on one hand, we've got communists of Jewish origin who are active in the communist movement, but who were absolutely not active in the Jewish milieu, right? Like, for example, Jakub Berman, who held one of the most of the highest positions actually in the party and in the Polish authorities. And everybody knew he was Jewish, but actually he himself did not keep in touch, with this Jewish milieu. He did not attend any sort of Jewish events. So it was, there were many people like that. And on the other hand, we had these Jewish communists like the one about whom I just talked, who actually considered that one of the most important features for them or of their Jewish identity was the Yiddish language and culture. And they were all very engaged, not only Sfat and Hala, who were because they were simply writers, right? I mean, they were poets, and they were really good poets. So it's kind of natural that a poet feels attracted to his or her native language. But also, for example, Bernard Marx, who was basically by your profession a lawyer, right? And afterwards, he was some sort of a self-made historian when he was heading the Jewish Historical Institute. He had there are many testimonies about him being actually someone who knew a lot about the Yiddish literature, and who also gave talks on Yiddish literature. And towards the end of his life, when he was almost blind because of his illness, he was actually able to, to give quotes like that from his memory, and like quote the passages from Yiddish authors just from his memory. And there are still people who remember this, that he was a great public speaker. So Yiddish was something that was very important to them, although probably it wasn't very clear, I mean, it was never openly, I haven't come across any sort of a clear declaration on their part, because Yiddish was considered to be important, as something that is needed by this Jewish part of the Polish society, right? Their own language is Yiddish, so we must keep Yiddish so that this way we can actually get to these people, right? And they needed, in order to as they put it in Yiddish, to ausleben sich, to live, fully live their Jewish identity. But eventually, one day, it won't be needed anymore, right? Because we will be speaking some sort of a common language for all of us. So it wasn't very clear what will happen next, because, for example, for David Sfard, he had a son from his second marriage, and while the parents spoke Yiddish between themselves sometimes, but they always spoke Polish, to the son, even though the father was a Yiddish poet, right, and a Yiddish activist. So it wasn't very clear, actually. So that was one thing. Another thing was the communism and the reasons for joining the communist movement, which usually were this vision of a world that won't differentiate between Jews and non-Jews, that will be a world full of justice for everyone, regardless of this person's ethnic background or whatever. One more feature that was extremely important was something which was called Nusach Polen. Nusach Polen in Yiddish means Polish variant. And that was basically the idea of creating some sort of, not maybe an autonomy, but actually some sort of a life, of a Jewish life in post-war Poland, a Jewish life based on some socialist values. That was connected with the fact that basically all these activists of this Jewish communist milieu survived in the Soviet Union, so they actually saw, the communists firsthand, right? But instead of being turned away or disappointed or whatever, they treated this as some sort of an experience to learn from, right? It's okay. So now we have seen how it did not work in the Soviet Union. It should work better. So we know how to build it in Poland, so we would avoid their mistakes. And this way of thinking about, this Jewish life in post-war Poland was called Nusach Polen by them, and it was something that really motivated them for many years. Then I have mentioned in this when presenting these three biographies, I mentioned the disappointment, that actually all three of them at a certain point, they survived a huge disappointment with the communist movement, and also in a way with Poland as such. So it came at various moments to various people. At 1956 at the earliest, or at the 1968 as at the latest. But it was also a kind of an experience that it is an integral part of this communist experience of theirs. And last but not least, it is their legacy, which might sound a little bit strange, but let me explain what I had in mind. So when I was thinking to myself, what actually remained, after them, after these three men that I was talking here about, I thought that actually there are things that still remain until today. In terms of Binem Haller, it is his poetry, which is unfortunately not very well known, even in this, I think even in the milieu of Yiddish scholars, he's not the most recognizable poet. But I suppose many of you recognize the song recorded by Chava Alberstein, Meine Schwester Chaye, which is quite often performed at various Holocaust-related events or Warsaw Ghetto uprising events. So this is actually a poem by Binem Haller about his own sister, Chaye, and Chava Alberstein put the music to it. Regarding Bernard Mark, even those a lot of his academic works, especially written in the first half of the 1950s, did not fit the academic standards, especially academic standards of today. Still, what the Jewish Historical Institute was doing in these years, it was important also in terms, for example, of publishing sources, digging out sources like the, Ringelblum's archive. So there are still things that are very important for us today for those working on post-war Jewish history. And also, I think that his diary, which I mentioned, is also one of these very important sources, which remains. And speaking about David Swart, let me come back to to the picture with his grandson. I think that from what he was engaged about these are these things that did not survive, did not remain, like the publishing house, even though this Socio-Cultural Association of Jews in Poland still exists, but it doesn't really play any important role. But actually, I was thinking, this is based on my talks with his son Leon. There are some family values that have been, transmitted down to next generations, because Swart's grandson is Michael Swart, who is an Israeli lawyer and a political activist who is specializing in the human rights law, and he's very recognizable in Israel, and I believe in the States as well. And this is something that he mentioned himself in one of the interviews, that this is something, this kind of thinking about the world, that he has it from his parents and from his grandparents. Like, one should fight for the world not to be a place full of injustice. If you see an injustice being done, you should do something about it. And this is the way that he interprets it these days, and how he lives these family values. So in a way, it makes a nice postscript, I think, to this story, at least of this particular family. And I think I will now. I think I have talked long enough. So as for me, this is all for now, and I guess we can move on with our program.
Wonderful, Yashu. That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so very much for this presentation, for introducing us to these three figures in post-war Polish Jewish milieu, Polish Jewish community. So I have to say that your book, and I really want to recommend to everyone to get your book because it's extraordinarily well written. It's well researched. There is no wonder it received the Jordan Schnitzer Award. I learned so much from you. So let me just go straight into just a couple of questions. Then I will ask Professor Hava Samuelson to ask her question, and then others. So I cannot help but wonder whether we should teach Jewish communism differently based on your book. Because, you know, what I teach my students, Jewish communists, what did they have to do with Jewishness? Cut their ties with their community of origin. They saw traditional community as those sites of backwardness, reaction. They were all for modernity, equality, internationalism, right? Rosa Luxemburg famously said, "I feel at home in the entire world, wherever there are clouds and birds and human tears." But the story of Sfard and Mark and others very much complicated, right? You mentioned the focus on Yiddish, but in the book you say, you push it even more, that they were actually interested in communal autonomy, like Jewish socialists, or am I reading it wrong? So there is that sectarian ethnic politics, which I see there, that I might be wrong here. So I wanted to ask you, does this group, how representative are they for Jewish communism more broadly, kind of beyond Poland? And maybe that says something. Maybe our understanding of Jewish communism in 20th century need to be rethought when we think about these men. Yeah, your thought.
Well, this is a very challenging question, you know. Well, they weren't part. Well, maybe I will say I will start like that. When I actually started to work on my PhD, I did not intend to work on Jewish communists. I wanted to work on the post-war Jewish history because it was relatively not so well researched by then. So it was post-war history, and I wanted to use, you know, my knowledge of Yiddish somehow. And I thought, okay, so here we've got this. For a short time, there was this association of Jewish writers active in post-war Poland. So I thought, okay, so let's work on them. And then I was looking for one of them, you know, to focus my research, and I just learned that actually there are memoirs written by David Sfard. So I thought, okay, this is, you know, a point that I can start with. And then I got interested. I thought, okay, so it would be interesting to see how a rabbi's son becomes a communist, right? Because it doesn't. To me, then it looked sort of strange. And then at a certain point, as I got deeper into this story, I came across a phrase which is quite commonly quoted in Poland in relation to Jewish communists, which is a phrase by Julian Strykowski, which is a Polish Jewish writer. He was writing in Polish in the 20th century, and he remained in Poland all his life. And he was also active in the communist movement before the war. And he said once that a Jewish person who becomes a communist ceases being Jewish, right? That it's not possible to join, to treat it together. It's either community, it's either or, right? It's not together. And I thought to myself, but it does not fit what I see in the sources, right? It just does not fit my picture. It's not what my sources tell me. Actually, these people, they are communists, and they are Jewish, and they want to remain both. They want to remain both. So I think it would be, but then the truth is that most communists of Jewish origin were not like that, right? They did not wish to speak Yiddish, right? Because why should they actually, right? It was like this ghetto language. So I suppose it would be maybe it doesn't need to like to refrain the whole idea of teaching, the teaching this experience of Polish Jewish communism, but maybe it would be worth mentioning that we've got also this kind of people, right? They were not only in Poland, actually. This Polish Jewish milieu, they kept in touch with similar milieus in France. I believe Audrey Kisielewski has written about this milieu in Paris, and they also kept in touch with the so-called progressive milieus, Jewish milieus in the United States. And here I believe it was I think Gennady Esteich might have written something about it. One of these persons, for example, in this Jewish communist movement or Yiddish communist movement in the United States, were Moishe Olgin in the interwar period. So, and actually also they sort of, like influence sometimes people abroad, because I remember reading in an article about Avram Sutzkever, who left who was never communist and who left for Israel. Actually, it was still Eretz Israel by then, in 1946, after the Kielce pogrom. He left Poland. And later, actually, he wanted to build up some sort of a Yiddish literary milieu, based, on what he saw in Poland, actually, like what he saw in postwar Poland, like what he saw being done by these Jewish communists. So at a certain point, it looked inspirational, although autonomy is not something it's not something they would call it on autonomy. Autonomy was considered not kosher, because the Bundists wanted to have an autonomy, and we don't want to have anything in common with Bundists. So autonomy was considered something not acceptable for communists, right? But in fact, what they had was some sort, of an autonomy, especially when we are thinking, for example, in the late 50s, they started to organize like summer camps for their children, basically for Jewish children, right? They were organized by the Socio-Cultural Association of Jews in Poland, and they were organized well into the 1960s, basically until 68. And most of these kids were the kids of people who were somehow engaged, with this Socio-Cultural Association. So their parents either were party members, or at least they had some close ties to other party members. And these were like Jewish camps, So actually, the kids were not speaking Yiddish, but I believe the camp hymn was sang in Yiddish. I think they learned it simply by heart. And they had, like evening meetings and evening talks about, I don't know, Israel or something else. So actually, on one hand, it was like, okay, we are Polish, but on the other hand, we are Jewish. And maybe it's also like kind of a, maybe it's also like, the answer to your question, that it was both, that it was supposed to be both. We don't have to give up being Jewish.
But the Jewishness, the meaning of Jewishness for them was mainly cultural.
Yeah, I think so. Cultural, I think cultural, yeah. And social, I would say also like social. It was a social thing. And actually, people who attended these who went to the summer camps. They are pretty well organized until nowadays. They keep in touch, you know, and it's something of a very strong, you know, generational experience for them. So there was something in it, you know. I'm not sure if I answer your question, actually.
Oh, great, thank you. Joasiu, to follow up on the Polish, right? Because we talked about Jewishness, communism, and this Polish element of this, and I found the relationship with Polish language, Polish culture, and Polish statehood to be quite fascinating in your book, because, for example, there was a moment there. For example, during the Second World War, they would not profess attachment to the Polish state, right, invaded by German and so on, but they were not criticizing it either, right? They would kind of keep their distance. And then, of course, after the war, with a Polish way, right? They become. Are they becoming Polish patriots in the way? I mean, could you tell us a little bit about that evolution, them and Polish state, Polish culture, language? Because I think it's quite complicated, right?
I think it's complicated. I think it depends on a particular person. When I'm thinking about David Swart, because this is the case, I know the best. Well, they did not. Well, first of all, they repatriated to Poland and they remained in Poland. Sooner, or I mean, shorter or longer, but for example, Swart remained in Poland quite long. They were all of them spoke Polish, of course, right? Yiddish was their native language, but it wasn't their only language. So they all spoke Polish and wrote in Polish and everything. Although Swartson told me that, you know, my father could write a speech in Polish, but he wouldn't write a poem in Polish, right? Poems were to be written in Yiddish only. So this makes a difference. But I think they were Polish patriots to some extent, at least. I would say they were patriot they were faithful to their vision of Poland, to the Poland which was supposed to guarantee them, you know, being equal with other citizens. So this is something they really, I believe they did care about. And I'm also thinking about you know, like the next generation, about their children. Swartson told me once a very moving moment when he was because this generation of their children, they basically feel, I think the parents still felt more Jewish than Polish, if they felt Polish at all. I'm not sure whether Swart felt Polish, although maybe in terms of like citizenship, you know, a language that he knew, some attachment, you know, to the, I don't know, Polish landscape, like places, like this, I would say Jewish Poland in a way, you know, Poland that was important to the Jews. But I think their parents rather felt simply Jewish. The next generation felt already both Polish and both Jewish, and it was 1968 that actually reminded them they were considered Jewish first of all, right? When I was talking to Leon Swart about his 1968 experiences, he told me a very moving story that when he felt he was unwelcomed, actually, he was active in this, he was very engaged in this students' protests of 1968. And at a certain point, there was a Polish colleague who said that, you know, our Jewish colleagues shouldn't be like the most visible faces of the protests, because then the press and the media focus on them and on their Jewishness, right? It's like, okay, here you see this whole protest is being done by the Jews, right? It's always the Jews who are discontent. And he told me that, this colleague of ours, he meant it very well, right? He just wanted to protect, he wanted to protect us. But this is when I felt that actually he doesn't consider me Polish, he considers me Jewish. And he was like, I don't care if the Polish authorities blamed me for being Jewish, and if they labeled me, this Jewish provocateur or whatever. But he did mind that it was his colleague who was also looking like this. And he was like, I believe it was one of the reasons that actually, the family decided to emigrate. By the way, this is a story which I once told to a friend of mine who is from a very, who's both Polish and Jewish, and she's from a very assimilated Jewish family. And she was like, I understand perfectly what he's talking about, because this is precisely what I would have felt if someone told me, to choose whom I am, right? I am both Polish and I am both Jewish, right? And these are my two identities. So I suppose it was also like one of the problems of the 1968, one of the reasons behind the emigration, that it was like, okay, you must choose your own identity, right? It's not possible to have both. So actually their Polishness was like removed from them. But I think they were somehow, they were for sure attached to it. I'm just right now thinking a story which I was told by a lady who used to work in the Jewish Historical Institute. And she was a young woman when she went to Israel somehow in the 1970s. It wasn't possible to go from Poland by then, so she was like going through Paris or somewhere, like hiding the fact that she was going to Israel. She was visiting some family of hers, and someone, the person she was visiting took her, to visit David Sfat, like, okay, we will go to see, Sfat. And this name didn't ring her any bell because she was away from this, Yiddish speaking milieu. And but she remembered, actually, she told me this, that when they came and simply, by joke, she greeted him in French because he also spoke French. And Sfat was very disappointed, and he was like, oh, but I thought it was someone from Poland, I wanted to talk to someone from Poland. And she didn't remember much from the visit because actually the ring, the name did not ring her any bell. But she remembered that when she came back to Poland and she, talked to her parents or the people from the older generations, they were like, oh my God, you met Sfat, So
Wow, thank you so much, Joasiu. So I have two excellent questions in Q&A. Before I bring them up, Chava, would you like to ask question?
Yes, actually, they're very similar to the line of thought that you started with. First of all, Joanna, I owe you an apology. I had written mistakenly the word communities instead of communists.
Oh.
But as you were talking, I would like to explore that necessarily Yiddish is going to be the cultural glue that created communities for these people, even though they don't have to speak in the language of autonomy, I don't think, but they have kind of a social environment to which they belong. So two things I would like to hear more about. I did not hear the word secularization or secularism or anything in your conversation. So how does that fit into the story? And particularly the issue of utopianism. So utopianism, you can think about the ideal future and you can talk about how wonderful communism will be if the goals are accomplished. But that's actually a secularization of the biblical understanding of the ideal end. So you can take the Asiatic view and turn it into some of the communist vision. So That's point number one, secularization, how it fits. And then number two, how do activities such as theater, not just literature, but theater, maybe a little bit of film, function in the creation of Yiddish-speaking communities? Because I know in Israel, my family in Jerusalem, not in the kibbutz, but in Jerusalem, was all engaged in the Yiddish theater and all engaged in the labor movement, but not the labor movement that the kibbutz belonged to, something else in Poalei Zion, primarily in Poalei Zion. So those are the two questions.
Thank you, Hava. These are great questions. And actually, yeah, these are topics which I didn't talk about because of the time, but I will be happy to say something more. So actually, yes. Well, the Yiddish theater, it played an immensely important role. And Svart himself was actually the literary director of the State Jewish Theater in Warsaw, which performed in Yiddish and actually exists until today. That was this theater directed by Ida Kamińska. And actually, this was some sort of, I would say, of a secular ritual, because they wouldn't speak Yiddish at home with the kids, but they would take the kids to the Yiddish theater, you know, for each new play. So this was something that you would do, you know. And this is connected with your question about secularization, because actually they were all well, they were communists, so they were not religious, right? And actually, some of them, when they had like some sort of well, house, well, some women helping, you know, in the house with raising up the kids. They were usually some Polish Catholic women. So Leon Svart told me that, you know, when I was a kid, I actually knew more about the Catholic rituals than about the Jewish ones, right? Because my nanny sometimes took me with her, you know, to the church because she had no one to leave me with. So so yes, it was pretty secular, and this is just like you said, this cultural glue. It was Yiddish in terms of secular culture, right? Which actually made it sometimes difficult, because I remember such an article from the early 1960s about the Jewish school in Wrocław. By this time there were several Jewish schools in Poland. They were all state-sponsored schools, so like official state public schools, with Yiddish as an additional class. I mean, the classes were taught in Polish, but there was also, you know, Yiddish being taught, and with a class in Jewish history. And actually, the article was in Volksstimme, which was the Yiddish periodical, which was published by the Socio-Cultural Association. And the article was about, they were talking, you know, to the Yiddish teacher at the school in Wrocław, who said that it's actually very difficult to teach Yiddish to these classes, because children come with very, their level of knowledge of Yiddish comes, you know, it's like from total zero, you know, to being fluent, depending on the family, you know. The more traditional family, then probably they have heard something. So it was one thing that was complicated. The second thing was that mostly they came from non-religious families, which meant that, for example, reading with them, you know, some classic work by, let's say, Sholem Aleichem. They were reading, she was giving the example of Motel Peisidem Chazans. And she was like, okay, so we are reading Motel Peisidem Chazans. They don't know the Hebrew words. Who was the Chazan, right? So this was this kind of question, and this kind of problems. So this secularization meant also like being cut off from a huge portion of actually Jewish experience, right? Like a cultural Jewish experience. And speaking about utopianism, yeah, so this is actually something. There is a great book by Jaw Schatz, who is himself a Polish Jewish emigre of 1968, based in Sweden. And in Sweden, in the 1980s, he he wrote his PhD dissertation, which is basically devoted to this generation of the fathers, generation of the parents engaged in the communism, where he actually presents it as a way of fulfilling those messianic-like longings, in a different form, like that. So actually, we are waiting for another kind of a Messiah, but it's still some kind of a Messiah, right? And he claims that this is why. That it was one of the reasons why actually those Jewish communists were attracted by the communism, right? Because it was, in a way, just like you said, it was something similar, right? So so this motive was very much present, actually.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, sure. So let me give voice to people on chat and in Q&A section. So we have our David Kader asked a question. Let me read it for you. I think you can also see it in Q&A. It may be difficult to generalize, even among the 3 individuals you focus on, but I wonder to what extent their communist identification is anchored to any extent in Jewish tradition. So what you just spoke about, be it the biblical prophets or late modern Jewish philosophers like Moses Hess, for example, who influenced Karl Marx. And this question might be tested by the relationship of these persons to Zionism, the universalism of communism versus the particularism of Zionism.
Yeah, so this is basically linked to what Chava asked me, right, about the utopianism. Right. As I said, Yavshatz has analyzed it properly and in depth in his book, which is by the way called The Generation, very appropriately. So basically, all of these people, they were really immersed in this Jewish traditional world. Not only Sfard, who was a rabbi's son, but basically all of them, they had not only the secular, but also the religious education. They were very well immersed in traditional classical Jewish texts, actually. Some of them are remembered to be able to quote, like passages from the Talmud, out of their memory. So they were very anchored, actually, in this tradition. And maybe even they did not realize them themselves to some degree. So it was definitely important. It was something they did not necessarily pass to their children, I believe. And speaking about the Zionism, yes, I think you're right here. I mean, it was the Zionism was considered some sort of something particular. Jewish oriented, right? So the meaning particular, and of course anything that was, particularism was very suspicious, in the communist eyes. So especially, although many of them actually they were Zionists in their youth. So many of them sort of converted from Zionism to communism. And I suppose also it was due to the fact that these were also people who they were this kind of people who wanted to be active, because not everybody is like that. So these particular people that I was talking about, they were active, and they it was important for them. It was a way for them to live their lives. So definitely, yes, to the whole idea of this influence of the Jewish tradition, even if they themselves, perhaps they wouldn't, admit to that. But for example, in this diary of Bermark, it is very visible, you know, that sometimes he quotes whom he was quoting, Yehuda ben Levi, I believe he was quoting in Hebrew, right? So it's obvious that they are really very well immersed, you know, it is their world. It is their world.
Yeah, the fact that Sfard ended up in Israel in 68, he didn't have to. The majority of immigrants of 1968 went elsewhere, right? To Sweden, to United States, to Canada, to Western Europe. But he ended up in Tel Aviv. So some Zionist longings of a communist.
Yeah, probably yes. I suppose he wanted to land where, you know, where Yiddish would be still, where there would be some sort of a vibrant Yiddish community, right? And Ida Kamińska was deeply disappointed when she moved to the United States, right? She was hoping to recreate the Jewish theater, Yiddish theater in the United States, and it turned out she had no public there. So perhaps Israel seemed a more natural choice. Actually, they went through France, so maybe they considered, you know, staying in France for a moment, because after all, Sfard spoke French, and he had, you know, this PhD from a French university. But finally, they landed in Israel, where he actually worked for the Yad Vashem, you know, in the last years of his life.
So let me follow with another question by our wonderful sponsors, Ninfa and Ron Lowe, who are wonderful friends of our community of Jewish Studies Center. So they have a following question. Following up on Anya's first comment, Joanna, does your research extend to those Jewish communists who hid their Jewish background? I ask because the mother of an ASU faculty member from what is now the Czech Republic was a dedicated participant in the communist movement. Her son, the faculty member, recently learned that his mother was Jewish, but hid that knowledge from him, just as Madeleine Albright's family hid the knowledge of her Jewish background from her, albeit probably for very different reasons. So do you also think about those who hid their Jewish background?
Well, I wasn't researching this particular topic, because actually this was a topic which was pretty well researched in Poland. There were these huge discussions starting in the late 1980s, and especially in the 1990s, when it was already possible to discuss this in the open, and which continue actually until today, about, you know, the so-called responsibility of Jewish communists for the communists in Poland, right? So because the right part of the political scene usually blames the Jewish communists, you know, for bringing the communism after the war to Poland. Which of course wasn't totally true, but anyway, there was a huge research, also more serious research, right, on these high-rank personalities of the communist movement who actually did have, you know, a Jewish background. So I was precisely interested, you know, in the other side of the story, actually. But this is quite a common story, I would say, for some Polish families of Jewish origins, who, for various reasons, sometimes for the feeling of security, preferred to hide their background in post-war Poland. Sometimes those people learned about their roots only in the 1968, you know, when the family decided to emigrate. Sometimes the family did not decide to emigrate, but still the kids were told. These are quite common stories, and luckily the contemporary Jewish community in Poland is pretty vibrant and pretty open also, and I think it has become much more normal these days, and at a certain point, I could even say it became sort of like fashionable, you know, to have Jewish roots in Poland, and This has changed for the better, I suppose.
For the liberal part of population.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, this is true. This is true. Yeah.
And Yashu, but I absolutely agree with that. Yashu, one more question, actually quite the question that should have been asked earlier. What role did the Holocaust play in their Jewish identity and creativity? This is Yehiel Greniman.
Yeah, thank you for this question. This is a very important one. And I should have mentioned this. It played a very important role. I mean, on one hand, all of these people, basically, well, most of these people, okay, most of these people, but all these three that I was talking about tonight, they survived the war in the Soviet Union. So they were not witnesses to the Holocaust as such. Yeah, they often lost various family members. Svart, for example, he lost his first wife. Was in the Warsaw ghetto and she did not survive. His mother was also killed during the Holocaust. And I think this is also something that made a huge difference between them and the rest of the Jewish population in Poland, because they were not accustomed to hiding their Jewishness because of the war. So actually they spoke about it, they talk about it. When I asked Leon Svart if he knew about, that his mother was the second wife, right? And he was like, yes, so of course, my father's, the picture of my father's first wife always hang in his cabinet, right? So we all knew. So it wasn't, I think also this was something that allowed them to be engaged in the in post-war Poland, in the sense that whatever happened in the Soviet Union during the war, even if they had some of them had like bad experiences, like going, through camps, Soviet camps, and like that, they were not persecuted as Jews. I'm talking about the war period, because later, of course, in the late 1940s, the situation has changed. But during the war, they were not in the Soviet Union persecuted as Jews. They could have been persecuted as, I don't know, rabbis, right, or clericals, or I don't know, merchants, whatever, right, like enemies of the communism, but not as Jews. And I believe this made it really a great difference between them and the rest of the Jewish population who survived the war in Poland by this way or another, but always with the feeling that actually it was more dangerous to be Jewish than Polish, during the war. So it was also something. I think they probably felt some sort of remorses that they were not here actually during the war, when their closest family members were killed. killed. And this topic of the Holocaust was all the time recurring in their literary works. Actually, Svart's first post-war volume of poetry is dedicated, to his relatives that perished in the Holocaust. There is a lot of this in Binem Heller's poetry. The whole Jewish Historical Institute was basically created in order to research, the Holocaust and what was happening to the Jews during the war. So they were. It was a recurring theme, and actually. The director of the Yiddish book publishing house in the 1960s was once complaining that, yes, we've got lots of a huge file, the manuscripts in Yiddish to publish, but all of them are about the Holocaust, right? We don't have like contemporary fiction in Yiddish, on contemporary Polish life. So that was a problem. My colleague Magdalena Ruta from the Jagiellonian University has actually published a lot on the topic of the Holocaust recurring, in the Yiddish literature, and her book was also translated into English because she's a literary scholar. She's working on this post-war Yiddish literature in Poland, and it was one of the topics that she researched. So I can recommend her book and her research. So it was something extremely important, and it was present all the time. But my feeling is that in contrary to some of the Jewish population who survived in Poland, in these families, it wasn't a taboo subject. Well, at least, in Svart's family, right? They were talking about it. They knew what it was all about, and it was also one of these most important annual events. I mentioned like visiting the Yiddish theater, but another of these events that made people feel that they are Jewish and they are together, right? They create a community. Was the annual celebration at the Warsaw Ghetto monument. The monument to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. It is in front of what is now the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And every year on the 19th of April, there is a huge ceremony. And this is something that actually those who felt some sort of a relation, to the Jewish community, they would go there on this particular day, to participate in the event. And it was one of the places to which you went when you felt Jewish, So so it's also important that it was connected, with the Holocaust and with the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Fascinating. Yeah, I ask you one more question. I think the last question, because we are running out of time. So I can see one more question here from Alana Goodman. How did the media and journalism play a role for the communist movement before the Second World War? I guess that's the question, right? Not before the communist movement, but for the communist movement before.
I think so, because I'm not sure if I understand it correctly. Yeah. Well, basically the communist press, the open communist press, was not allowed in Poland before in the interwar period because of the censorship. So it was either the illegal, completely
illegal, right?
Yeah. So either it was completely illegal, or it was something that was, I would say, quasi-communist. So we are not saying openly that we are communist, but for example, we publish a lot of articles about how good it is in the Soviet Union. And there was such a Yiddish daily newspaper, which was called the Feind, the friend or the comrade, actually. No, comrade would be Haber. The Feind, which appeared for a year or so, and it was actually also a funny story because it was sponsored by someone who had nothing in common, with the communist movement. It was quite an eccentric person from Vilnius, who would regularly, tell his communist editors that, I'm just waiting for you, to go to the jail, because one day you will surely go, for what you publish. And they were working there for a year or so. So, but I'm not sure if it's really hard to say. We don't have any sort of a research of how this kind of periodicals influence, and whether it influenced at all, the Jewish community. There are testimonies about, the issues being read by one issue being read by many people, but we don't really know. there is more to that, to this story after the war, where we had the I mentioned already Volksstimme, which was the official publication of the Socio-Cultural Association of Jews in Poland, but it became labeled as such only in 1956, because before it was actually the periodical published by the so-called Jewish faction of the Polish Communist Party. And in 1956, it decided to be labeled as, you know, the periodical of the Socio-Cultural Association of Jews, which sort of like meant being open to more than just party members, you know, like being open for the whole Jewish community, because in their minds, you know, basically the Jewish community were, these were those who, well, were members of these organizations, or at least they were somehow, you know, in their somehow influenced by them, you know, like attending, you know, the events and stuff. So it was more important actually in post-war Poland than in the interwar one. But the fact is that we don't really know much about this interwar period. You know, these are very, sometimes these are very like, many of these people actually did not survive, because not everybody was able to escape to the Soviet Union. So the testimonies that we have are not always reliable, and sometimes they are very, very short and, you know, not giving details.
Oh, excellent, excellent, Joasiu. Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation, for answering all our questions. It was just wonderful. Thank you so much. Hava, is there anything else we need to say at the end? We are finishing, closing the official part.
Yeah, I'll be, yes, sure. So I, of course, first and foremost, I would like to thank you, Joanna. I'm going to call you Joanna rather than
That's fine.
But I think that it's so important that you brought the communist Jewish experience to the conversation about Jewish history, because it's kind of a marginal topic that doesn't get the attention probably that it deserves. And you know, speaking of how this community perpetuates itself, I would like to see some kind of you probably did it already, comparative discussion of Yiddish culture in Israel, in the United States, and in Latin America, especially in Mexico, and how people from Mexico came to Israel and created the Yiddish department in the Hebrew University. This is Chava Dorniansky.
I know, yeah, I know her.
Okay, she used to, we used to be good friends. So I think that there's so much to learn from this picture to enable us to think, what does it mean to be Jewish, which is exactly where you started. What does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be communist? All the thinking about ideal reality and the disappointments that come with ideal reality. And the one thing I would like to suggest to you is the book of Yuri Sluskin. I'm not sure that I'm pronouncing his name correct. The House of Government, which is the subtitle is Saga of the Russian Revolution, where most of the people in that particular, you know, building were Jews. All the leaders were Jews. All the issues were Jewish issues. It's a fascinating book. He was the first speaker in the Lowe lecture series several years back.
Thank you for the recommendation. Yeah,
it's a wonderful book. And Anya, for you for organizing not just this series, but also the series last year. I also would like to thank the Lowe family for supporting Jewish studies, and for the Malikian Center for working with us to promote knowledge about this particular part of you know, Central and Eastern Europe. And all in all, I wish all of you a very healthy, very joyous and peaceful New Year. And now you're going to say it in Yiddish. Can you say it? Because I don't know Yiddish. So whatever it is, a Zissen year or something like that. So Shana Tova Umetuka, really, but we wish all of you, and it's really going to be great to continue to learn from you and other scholars in Poland, which is what this lecture series is all about. And we can only do it because of Anya, right? We could not reach this kind of scholarship without the mediation of Anya here. So thank you all. Have a very good afternoon or evening, wherever you are, and we'll see you shortly. I guess the next activity would be in October.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Once again, thank you. Can I ask you just one more? I'm sorry. Women, I meant it was just at the... What about women communists? Right?
Oh.
And
well, they were some. They were some, of course, but basically this is a very male story. You can also see it, on the picture right here. I mean, this is a very male story, but this is like it is. I mean, but they were some women communists, of course. Some of them are actually even mentioned in my book. I was thinking when I was looking through pictures to choose for this lecture, I came across a picture that featured both Swart and Wanda Wasilewska, which is like the most recognizable Polish women, in the communist movement, actually, like the feminine face, of Polish communism. So they have a picture together, yeah. So yeah, but this is yeah. I don't. Sorry, I don't want to go already into details. So.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry. I don't want to keep you any longer. It's already 10:30 in Poland. So.
But it was, no, thank you so much for inviting me. It was a real pleasure to be here. And I just hope I was speaking, well, coherent enough, taking into account the hour. But it was a real pleasure. And I'm really grateful, for your questions. And it was really a pleasure to be here.
Our pleasure too.